Gordon Allport was an American psychologist who is known for making personality popular in academic circles and also in the general public. He spent nearly his entire career studying personality traits. Gordon Allport was the youngest of 4 boys. He was born in Indiana to a mother who was a teacher and religious and strict. His father was a salesman who ended up becoming a doctor later in life. From a young age, he developed inferiority feelings. He was too young to play with his older brothers and the neighborhood kids. As a child, he felt like he wasn't good enough and experienced some loneliness. He attempted to compensate for these feelings by excelling, by doing his best in everything that he did. Even after he became a world-renowned psychologist, he still experienced feelings of inferiority. Gordon's older brother, Floyd, was also a famous psychologist. Throughout Gordon's life, he tried to emulate much of what his older brother did. When Floyd published a book, it put pressure on Gordon to publish a book. Gordon earned his PhD in psychology from Harvard University in the 1920s. He studied with some of the most famous psychologists in Germany and England. He was well connected. Gordon spent his life at Harvard University. He was there for 40 years, where he studied personality and social psychology. He was also an active volunteer throughout his life. He really cared about other people. Even his colleagues and students noted that he was genuinely concerned about other people. He published most of his work in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and he received many awards throughout his career. Most notably, he was the first person to research personality traits in the United States. He was also the first person to teach a personality course in the United States. Allport defined personality as something that changes, it's dynamic. He defined it as a psychophysical system, a system that connects the mind with the body, and he defined it as something that influences our behaviors and our thoughts. He suggested personality develops both from heredity, which provides the raw materials like our appearance, our level of intelligence, the raw materials that are then shaped or limited by our social environment. Nature and nurture combine to create a unique personality. Allport proposed a number of challenges to Freud's initial theory. He did not believe that the unconscious was the dominant force in personality. He emphasized the conscious more than the unconscious. Allport spent some time with Freud and allowed him to perform his traditional psychoanalysis, but Allport was not impressed with the process or the results. This experience led him to start challenging some of Freud's basic ideas. He believed the best way to study normal personality was to focus on individuals who had developed normally and in a healthy manner. He did not believe it was appropriate to compare healthy adults to children, to neurotics, to individuals with abnormal personalities, and to pets and animals. Allport suggested that personality is made up of what he called traits. Now, you and I use this word often when we talk about personality. We talk about personality traits. This concept, this term, came from Gordon Allport's work. He defined traits as the enduring, long-lasting characteristics that guide our behavior. Personality as a whole is dynamic, it changes, but these traits are the components of personality that slow down that process. They are more enduring, more difficult to change. Initially, Gordon believed traits were real, something that was tangible inside all of us. He did not initially describe them as theoretical constructs or labels. He suggested we can measure traits by observing behavior and the consistency of that behavior over time and across situations. He measured personality traits on a continuum. He would take one trait and place it on a line. You could score low on that dimension or high on that dimension. He believed that traits are interrelated and sometimes overlap, but they still represent different parts of who we are. For instance, aggressiveness and hostility are two different traits, but they are related. And you will frequently observe aggressive behavior with hostile behavior. He suggested that personality traits contribute to, determine, or cause some behaviors. These behaviors will vary from situation to situation based on the social, the environmental, and the cultural context. There are two major types of personality traits: individual traits and common traits. While he recognized that these traits are the cause of many of our behaviors, he also recognized that sometimes we do things by choice and because we are driven by biological needs. Individual traits are unique to a person. Common traits are shared by many people. Individual traits were eventually relabeled as personal dispositions. He used the word traits too many times, it got a little confusing, so he changed the name to personal dispositions. A person's traits vary in terms of intensity and significance. Some of your traits are said to be more important, more expressed than your other traits. There are three major types of personal dispositions: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. He also relabeled common traits just traits. These common traits, these qualities that we share with other people, are impacted by the environment, by the individuals that we surround ourselves with, and the events we experience throughout our lives. Cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits influence our behaviors and thoughts to different degrees. The most influential type is the cardinal trait. Allport defined this as a ruling passion, a quality that is so intense and pervasive that it rules most areas of your life. When you ask your friends and family to describe your personality traits, the first or second quality that they mention is probably going to be your cardinal trait. It's that thing that everyone notices about you right off the bat. Everyone has a few central traits. These are the themes that best describe your behavior. They are less influential than your cardinal trait, but more influential than your secondary traits. This includes qualities like aggressiveness, self-pity, cynicism. Secondary traits are the qualities that are a little bit more difficult for the outside world to identify. These are your preferences for different things in your environment. These traits may be so weak that only your best friend or your closest caregiver could pick them out. Includes things like your preferences for music, your preferences for travel, your preferences for what to do in your free time. Allport also challenged Freud's notion that The necessary goal of life is to reduce tension. Allport suggested it was the opposite, that the goal of life is actually to increase tension because this tension motivates us. So we need it. We need tension in order to get up and get moving. Furthermore, Allport suggested that it's the process of achieving a goal that is rewarding to us. It's not so much the reaching of the goal and the achieving of the goal, it's the road getting there. That's what we find so rewarding. The putting in of hard work is what makes the achievement of a goal so meaningful. Therefore, meeting one challenge motivates us to meet another challenge. Once you meet the challenge, tension is reduced. Your goal then is to increase that tension with another goal. Without goals, without tension, we aren't really living, according to Allport. Allport agreed with Freud that personality begins to develop in childhood. However, Allport also thought personality develops in adulthood. He did not think that childhood experiences impacted our adult personality. He actually suggested the two are distinct and not related. That is, we have a personality in childhood and then we have a personality in adulthood. Sure, sometimes they're related, but they don't necessarily have to be in order for someone to be healthy. His concept of functional autonomy captures this idea. This is the notion that our adult motives are not functionally connected to the experiences from childhood that initially created those motives. That is, the forces in childhood that motivate us become independent of those childhood experiences. We may be motivated by similar things in childhood and in adulthood, but those motives are not connected, according to Allport. This idea of functional autonomy does not apply to behaviors driven by biological desires, neuroses, reflexes, fixations. He included healthy, normal behavior in his concept of functional autonomy. Compared to the other theorists we've covered so far, Allport's theory is probably the most optimistic. He disconnected childhood personality and adulthood personality because he believed adults have more choice, more free will, more say in how their personality develops than had been previously proposed. He suggested that adults are really developing through their future aspirations, their goals, the challenges that they continuously seek. These experiences are shaping their personalities more so than their childhood experiences. He argued that psychology had spent too much time focusing on the past and not enough on the current and the future. Allport believed that there are a subset of behaviors, such as addictions and some of our habits from childhood, that no longer provide any real benefit to us, but are residuals from our childhood. So he disconnected the two, childhood personality and adulthood personality, but he recognized that sometimes low-level routine behaviors from childhood, from earlier in life, can persist throughout adulthood. It's just that they don't really provide the same kind of value, the same kind of function that they used to. These behaviors, though, are so basic that we can't include them in personality. He didn't believe they belonged in the definition of personality. Our appropriate functioning is an organizing process. It helps us organize information about ourselves, about the world, and helps us maintain a sense of self. This organizing process determines how we think about the world, how we remember the world, and how we think about what we're going to do in the world. According to Allport, the ego keeps appropriate motives that enhance our self-esteem and lets go of those motives that don't benefit us, that don't help our self-esteem. In an effort to maintain our sense of self, he suggested we are guided by several principles. The principle of organizing the energy level has to do with where our motives come from and how our energy is then organized to fulfill those motives, those needs, those desires. The principle of mastery and competence is the idea that healthy, mature adults are motivated to master new skills, to develop both personally and professionally, to become the best version of who they are. The principle of appropriate patterning suggests that we all strive for consistency and wholeness in the development of personality. If our motives can change, come from different sources, if we are motivated to develop our skills, and if we're motivated to develop a consistent personality, you can see how all three of these organizing principles can help us develop a healthy sense of self, one that is high in self-esteem and one that is consistent across situations. Allport proposed 7 stages of personality development. The first 3 stages occur in the first 3 years of our lives. Stages 4 and 5 occur at ages 4 and 5. Stage 6 occurs from ages 6 to 12, and then the 7th and final stage occurs in adolescence. Before the proprium develops, infants have no personality. They do not separate themselves from the environment, from other people. There is no sense of me in the first year of life. Babies respond to external stimuli reflexively, not so much by choice. He described infants as pleasure-seeking, destructive, selfish, impatient, and dependent. By the end of the first stage, infants are starting to become aware of themselves as something distinct and different from the other people in their environment. At the end of this first stage, infants are beginning to realize that they are distinct from the objects in their environment and the people in their environment. The second stage occurs in the second year of life and was referred to as the self-identity stage. It is during this stage that children come to learn and understand that they are in fact different from their parents, they are different from their siblings. A sense of me has developed in most children by the time they reach 2 to 3 years old. They also learn that even though the environment changes, they stay the same and their personality stays the same. In the third stage, which occurs in the third year of life, children learn to take pride in their accomplishments and develop a sense of self-esteem. Between the ages of 4 and 5, children undergo an extension of the self. They learn to recognize that other things, other objects, other people in the environment are theirs, are connected to them, are associated with them. Their parents are an extension of themselves. Their toys are an extension of themselves. Their house is an extension of themselves. Then, between the ages of 5 and 6, children go through the self-image stage. At this stage, they develop actual and idealized images of themselves. So a realistic current version of themselves and a version of themselves in the future. Kids in this age group also begin to recognize whether or not they are satisfying their parents' expectations. Between the ages of 6 and 12, children begin to realize that reason and logic can be applied to everyday problem solving. They recognize that the games and the toys they played with helped them develop skills that they now can use to solve problems on their own, to do things for themselves, to become more independent. In the final stage of Allport's personality development model, he suggested that adolescents finally develop their proprium, that during this stage, personality is complete. He called this stage appropriate striving because this is the age at which humans begin to dream about the future and make long-term plans for their goals after adolescence. Throughout the 7 stages of personality development, he said that the interactions between children and their parents are important to whether or not they are able to move forward to the next stage, move forward with their growth and development. He paid more attention to the role of mothers than of fathers, as did the other theorists that we talked about. We are in the middle of the 1900s when it was still fairly common for women to be the caretakers. The bond between an infant and mother is especially crucial for affection and security. If a child's needs are met, these needs for security and affection, if these needs are met, the proprium, the personality, develops steadily and gradually. These children will develop motives that then help them achieve their dreams and goals in adulthood. If their needs are frustrated or not met at all, these children often become insecure, aggressive, jealous, and self-centered. Some of these children become neurotic adults who rely on the strategies from childhood to deal with the world. How does an adult know whether they are normal, mature, and healthy? Allport had a list of 6 criteria that we can use to determine how well our proprium has developed. Do you extend your sense of self to people and activities beyond yourself? Do you relate well to other people? Do you exhibit intimacy, compassion, sympathy, empathy? Do you have a high degree of self-acceptance? Do you love yourself? Do you like who you are? Do you hold a realistic perception of who you are, your goals in life, and what you want to become? Do you have a sense of humor? Do you sometimes objectify yourself in order to make other people laugh? Do you feel like your personality is unified? Do you feel like all aspects of your personality are helping you reach the goals in your life? Allport believed that personality is so complex that we need to rely on a variety of methods in order to truly understand someone's personality. I have 11 of the many methods that he wrote about that he urged other psychologists to use. Allport used what he called the personal document technique to try to infer personality traits from someone's writing samples, from their autobiography, letters they've written, their diaries. He believed their words and their style of writing could tell him something about their personality. He was a big fan of the idiographic approach, studying a single individual case in depth. His most famous case is that of Jenny. He is said to have analyzed more than 300 of her letters and used that information to treat her current symptoms. Allport is the first of the theorists we've covered in this class to create a personality test. In 1960, he published with two of his colleagues, Vernon and Lindsay, he published the study of values. This test is said to measure our personal values, and then our personality traits can be inferred from those values. Allport and his colleagues had come to a point where they believed that values, which are long-lasting beliefs, opinions, priorities, are correlated with personality traits. So they developed this personality test based on values. They proposed that everyone, to some degree, possesses all of the values that they highlighted, but that for most people, one or two of these values will be dominant and therefore tell us something about their personality. Here are the 6 values that Allport and his colleagues described. Theoretical values are concerned with the discovery of truth, of information, the tendency to want to learn. Economic values are concerned with the usefulness, the practicality, the applicability of an idea, an object, a product, a service. Aesthetic values are concerned with artistic experiences and concepts related to beauty, form, grace, harmony. Social values reflect our beliefs about human relationships, about helping other people. Political values are related to our ideas about power, about prestige and influence. Religious values are concerned with the mystical and understanding the universe, why it was created, why we are here, what purpose do we serve. We already know that he studied writing samples. He also believed we should focus on how people act, on their expressive behaviors and on their coping behaviors. Expressive behaviors are those that we aren't aware we are doing. It's the little things that maybe you don't notice you do, but that might tell us something about who you are. Coping behaviors are easy to change, and we are aware that we are doing these things. There are 2 reasons I wanted to share Allport's emphasis on expressive behaviors. One, because he is partly responsible for moving us away from trying to measure the unconscious with dream analysis and free association, moving us away from the unconscious to the conscious, to behaviors that the therapist can actually observe. Modern researchers have found that expressive behaviors can tell us a little bit about people's personalities. For instance, facial expressions are correlated with personality traits. Women and children tend to be better than men and older people at reading facial expressions. Close friends are better than strangers at decoding our own facial expressions and the emotions that are typically associated with our facial expressions. In other words, your close friends know you better than strangers, and they know your facial expressions better than strangers. There are as many as 7 distinct emotions that can be inferred from facial expressions. We also know from some modern physiological research that when we look at pictures of people smiling, the muscles in our own faces actually move. In other words, we recognize some facial expressions, namely smiles, we recognize them by unconsciously mimicking them. We also know that depressed people tend to be better at recognizing sad emotions, and we've even taught computers how to recognize basic human emotions. There are several strengths of Allport's theory. His work was the most influential in terms of getting personality theory into psychology departments, into psychology classrooms, and into mainstream America. Because Allport focused on healthy adult personality, and because he recognized both nature and nurture in terms of their influence on personality development, his theory was extremely popular at the time. In fact, many of his colleagues believed that his theory was better than Freud's, Jung's, Adler's, Hornet's, Erikson's theories. We were at a time in our country's history where these ideas about the American dream, the white picket fence, if you work really hard, you can become anything you want to. These ideas were reflected in Allport's theory. His work then had a positive impact on soon-to-be psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Unfortunately, his theory of proprium development, of personality development, is difficult to test using experimental methods. So we cannot confirm whether or not his 7 stages are, in fact, the 7 stages that all humans go through in order to develop a healthy personality. There are some questions that we still have today about his concept of functional autonomy and this disconnect between childhood personality and adulthood personality. It's not quite clear why, how this works. And we do have quite a bit of evidence that childhood personality tends to be correlated with adulthood personality. Doesn't mean you can't change, it just means the two tend to be correlated. The final criticism of Allport's theory is that it cannot be generalized to everyone. He was so focused on the uniqueness of personality and used so many different methods to assess personality that we can't replicate what he did and how he did it. That is all for this lecture. Thank you for watching yet another video in this class. Next week, we will turn our attention to some of the other trait theories of personality, like the Big Five model, which many of you are probably familiar with.